Hello. In this segment, we will discuss a job order costing system. Companies that manufacture products need to account for the cost of production, and there's two different costing systems that enable them to do that. The first is a job order costing system. This system is used for production of large, unique, or high-cost items, such as cars, boats, or special order items. These type of products are built to order rather than being mass-produced. They incur many costs that can be directly traced to each job. The other type of costing system is a process costing system. This is used for companies that make large quantities of homogeneous products that are difficult to distinguish from one another. A process costing system will be discussed at a later time. We can see the flow of costs through a job order costing system. Recall that there are three costs companies incur when producing a product. They have material cost, they have labor cost, and they have indirect costs, which we classify as factory overhead. Material costs in a job order production system. Direct materials. Direct material costs are recorded right into the goods in process inventory account as they are incurred on the units produced. Indirect material costs, the actual indirect material cost, are recorded first into the factory overhead account. Labor cost, the direct labor cost of manufacturing products are recorded directly into goods in process as those labor costs are incurred. Actual indirect labor costs are recorded into a factory overhead account. This factory overhead account can be thought of as a clearing account. This account will keep track of actual factory overhead costs as they are incurred. Because we need a full cost of producing inventory into the goods in process inventory account, instead of recording actual inventory costs into this account, we are going to apply or allocate an estimate of the indirect costs into goods in process. We have to use an estimate because most companies will not know the true amount of their actual indirect cost of production until much later in the accounting period, after the inventory has been completed and possibly sold. So what goods in process inventory account does is it accumulates the actual direct material cost, the actual direct labor cost, and an estimate of the indirect cost. That account will maintain those costs until the manufactured items are completed and ready for sale. At that time, the costs are transferred out of goods in process and into the finished goods inventory account, and only become an expense when the inventory is sold. In the meantime, we have to keep track of the actual indirect costs as they are incurred. So like we had seen, actual indirect material costs are being recorded in factory overhead. Actual indirect labor costs are being recorded in factory overhead. And as all other factory overhead indirect costs, such as factory utilities, factory rent expense, factory depreciation, etc., all of those actual indirect costs are being recorded in the factory overhead account. So this account is keeping track of actual indirect costs as they are incurred, and it is keeping track of the estimate that we are recording into goods in process, or the estimate of our indirect costs. We can see the flow of those costs through the accounts in the general ledger by examining T accounts. Raw materials. The first inventory account. Beginning balance plus the cost of raw materials that are purchased for use in production, less the amount of materials that are used in production. Of those raw materials used, the direct material portions are recorded into goods in process, and any indirect material costs are recorded in factory overhead with a debit. Direct labor cost. Actual direct labor costs are debited directly into goods in process. Actual indirect labor costs are debited into factory overhead. The factory overhead costs recorded here in goods in process are an estimate. The credit of the amount of the estimate is put here into factory overhead with a credit. So goods in process is accumulating the three costs of production: actual direct materials, actual direct labor, and an estimate of our indirect overhead costs. When units are completed and ready for sale, the total cost is credited out of goods in process and debited into finished goods. Those costs remain in finished goods until the inventory is sold, and only at that time are those costs recorded as cost of goods sold. We can see down here the factory overhead account. This account is being debited for actual indirect factory overhead costs, and it is being credited for an estimate of the indirect overhead costs anticipated.